Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer, healthier, and more engaged lives, not only for ourselves and our couples, but also for companies and countries. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Niobe Way, author of Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. She's also a professor of developmental psychology at NYU, whose groundbreaking research has transformed how we understand boys, friendships, and the very human need for connection. In her latest book, Niobe distills over 4 decades of research to uncover the hidden emotional lives of boys and what their struggles teach us not only about them, but also about ourselves. We'll explore her insights into how our culture's rigid boy culture norms disconnect us from one another, the mental health impacts of this crisis, and her vision for building a more connected, curious, and relational world. Get ready for an enlightening conversation about gender, culture, capitalism, and the transformative power of curiosity. Niobe Way, welcome to Four Quarter Lives. I'm really delighted to have you and so looking forward to this particular conversation.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Avivah. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Niobe, your latest book, which is Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. You describe this as your professional manifesto because it distills over 40 years of your research on human emotional development. Can you share a little bit what initially inspired you to focus on boys' friendships and how this research and everything in it has evolved over these 4 decades?
So I will try to answer that very big question in as brief as possible because it's a lot of it.
We got a bit of time. We're going to take all the time we need.
Okay, good. So was trained. It's important that I start off with this so people understand how I think. I was trained in a field called human development and psychology, which is interested in the processes of human development. And I got my doctoral training in the Harvard Ed School with people like Carol Gilligan and Howard Gardner and lots of people who were changing entirely how we were thinking about humans. And I'm going to start the story with that.
The titans of it all.
Yeah, the titans of it all. Because I'm just going to start with that because being a doctoral student in the 80s, with those kinds of thinkers and feelers in my department, changing how we think about humans had a massive impact on me to sort of look for the stories that aren't being told, right, in the old methods we used to use in the 80s and 90s, and we still continue to use mostly just the one method field in the study of adolescence, which is surveys. And Carol Gilligan broke that open in a lot of ways, and so did other people too, but she was ahead of that. So anyway, so having mentors that were telling big stories about everybody, not just about a particular population, but about everybody in different ways, Howard Gardner included. Interested in adolescence, I was part of my doctoral training. I worked in public schools. And in this particular public school in Jamaica Plain in Boston, I was a counselor, I wasn't really a counselor, but I was working with kids individually to sort of talk through what they were struggling with. And I was there as a doctoral student to sort of help them out and et cetera. And what I was struck by, this is 1988.
Yeah.
I was struck by the extent to which the boys in particular talked about their friendships. And I was sort of blown away because in my doctoral traying, I hadn't even heard that friendships were important for teenage boys. And it didn't occur to me. I mean, it wasn't part of my training on developmental psychology. It wasn't in my classes on adolescent development. Even in Carol's class, when she talks a lot about friendships, so the focus was primarily on girls and women, right? So it just didn't occur to me that this would be a struggle. And I remember thinking, whoa, like that's all they're
talking about. And a lot of women think like that still. Yeah.
Exactly. No, exactly. I'll get there because we haven't changed so much. I'll get there. Ask me that question toward the end if I forget to answer it because it's important that we haven't changed so much. So then I began to wonder, first of all, what's going on with boys and young men in terms of their friendships? Why are they struggling so much? What's happening? And then I also started to wonder why that story isn't being told. Why is the story of friendships, if it's told at all, is about girls and young women, not about boys and young men, and what is going on with that? And then the other thing that I think is important to say to you, Avivah, because I always embody my researches in terms of my own experience too, is I remembered I have 2 brothers. And I remember that for my brothers, that was true too. And I had forgotten because it's like you don't see something unless it's familiar.
Yep.
You don't see things that are unfamiliar. So I had totally forgotten that my brothers also struggled with their friendships during adolescence. And I had just remembered thinking about it, but just didn't register. So anyway, so then I started really a career. I graduated from Harvard. I then went on to do a postdoc at Yale, doing something very different, was looking at adolescent mothers with a professor there. And then I arrived at NYU as an assistant professor and dived right in to trying to look at friendships and social emotional development among teenagers. I never have just focused on boys and young men. It's always that's the story that's the most interesting that we need to tell. But I've always looked at kids of all identities. So I got a National Science Foundation grant, a William T. Grant Foundation. I say that because I was federally funded to do research starting in 1996 to begin these longitudinal studies of friendships and to figure out during, I'd start in middle school or high school, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and then I'd follow them over the same kids over 4 or 5 years. And about 2005, after doing this research for about 10 years, longitudinal studies, multiple schools, multiple places, kids, very, very ethnically, racially diverse kids, kids who go to public schools. So mostly kids in working class families, communities, et cetera. Some middle class kids, but very, very ethnically, racially diverse. So after about 2005, essentially, I realized there was a story happening with the boys and their friendships. And I'll jump ahead in a second to tell you what the story was. But then I reached out to Harvard Press and I said, I think I got a book here about boys' friendships and what happens from early to late adolescence and what appears to be a crisis of connection that happens as they get older. And I want to write a book about it. And so they gave me a contract. And then 2011, Deep Secrets, Boys' Friendships and the Crisis of Connection came out. And I'll tell you the findings in a second. And that led to an inundation, Avivah, of attention from the media. I was on the Today Show, I think 2 or 3 times. I was in the New Yorker. I was in the New York Times.
You struck a nerve.
I struck a nerve. And I was blown away. I literally expected a little book about boys' friendships. It was published by an academic press. Usually academic press books don't get much attention. And I was really struck. And then, of course, Carol was my mentor. She's now my close friend. But she said it was the kind of reaction she got with Meeting at the Crossroads. Not quite as extensive as in a different voice. But when she came out with Meeting at the Crossroads about adolescent girls, she said it was very similar. And she was struck by how similar it was. Yeah. That it had struck a nerve about boys. And I started to get inundated also with thousands of emails from around the world. So boys and men up to age 80, 90 years old, they would tell me their age. And young boys would write me and say, you're telling my story, men from all over the world. And so I was totally struck, but this is the other thing I was hit by, an inundation of girls and women, and even including non-gender conforming people, would write me and say, you're telling my story. So then I thought, okay, what's going on here?
They were saying my story about my experience of boys or my own?
Well, both. Sometimes they would say, this is my brother, this is my father, et cetera. But sometimes they would say, it's my story. Yeah. Like, this is not just a boy's story. This is my story. And then I started to realize, I started to read the larger body of science that's in my new book. And now jumping ahead, I came out with a book recently called Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. And in that book, I realized, before I wrote it, obviously, I realized that what the boys were telling us was not just relevant to them, it was relevant to all of us. And it was about the roots of our crisis of connection, why we're so depressed, anxious, lonely, suicidal, and violent, mass violence in particular that's soared in the last 2 decades. So it's not just a story about them, it's a story about us. And the science, the larger body of science over the past 20th century, actually, and this is the most amazing thing, Avivah, for one nerd to the other, it actually tells the same story the boys tell, but they talk about it for humans, not for boys, but they talk about it. So I'll tell you now what boys taught me that was repeated in the science. This is the 4-part story. Okay. I call it actually a 5-part story because I include solutions at the end, which we'll talk about at the end. But the 4-part story that boys tell me, and then I'll talk about the solutions at the end, this is what they teach me. That's not, again, I'm going to repeat it because a lot of people have a hard time hearing this. It's not just about boys, it's about all of us. Although the boys are the one teaching us about it. So they're telling us about them, but then it's relevant to everybody. So the first theme is that they started to tell me back in 1996, I could hear it, is their incredible desire for close friendships with other guys. The 12, 13, 14-year-old boys that is what Carol calls the human voice of saying, I want friendships, I need them, I can't live without them. If they have them, they talk about how much they love them and how much they want to be able to have other boys they can share their secrets without being vulnerable, without being laughed at. The whole not being laughed at when I have something serious to share was a big theme.
Yep.
But the idea of wanting someone to share those intimacies. Part of that theme that I always want to underscore for your listeners is it wasn't just the expression of desire, but their emotional and relational intelligence that was so obvious in the way they spoke. So even though they have the slang of sort of teenagers in their speaking and saying like every 2 seconds, the reality is that the way they're articulating, and people have to check this out in both books, but their language is so poetic in how they talk about their feelings and their desires. And Carol once said, Carol Gilligan, when I say Carol, I mean Carol Gilligan, she once said, this could never be a book about girls. And I said, why is that? And she said, because the language is so raw. She said, it's so raw and so poetic that girls cover over more than boys, in her opinion. But it was interesting. So, because I heard this language when they were 12, 13, 14, 15. So that's the first thing they teach us, is that not only do girls and women and want friendships, but boys and men are just as starving for close friendships. Second theme, they directly linked it. This is not an interpretation of me as a researcher. They directly said it. Mental health. The importance of friendships for mental health. If they didn't have the friendships they want, they would go, and this is their words, wacko. I would want to kill myself. I'd be all alone, right? I'd have no one to talk to. I wouldn't want to be here. And they said that started, I've been hearing that theme for decades, right? And so I just want to say to your listeners, we have to get off of thinking that the problem is mental health. No, the problem is a crisis of connection that's leading to our mental health problems. Okay, so they linked it to mental health. That's the second theme. The third theme is what you began to hear from early to late adolescence in boys. And this is something that you hear in boys and young men, I think, more than to other teenagers, but you're starting to hear it as much, by the way, recently, is what I call a crisis of connection. And that's where boys started to disconnect even from their desires for friendships. They'd say, I'm fine, I'm okay. It's not, I can't find the friend I want. It doesn't matter. Who cares? I mean, there's the sort of like whatever voice. But in that voice, there'd also be a tremendous sadness and a sense of isolation and loneliness and depression. And you heard the depression in their text. It's also the time, by the way, the crisis of connection, if you look at the literature, where boys die by suicide at that age, 15, 16, 17, they commit mass violence. So you hear this crisis of connection. And then in the larger body of data, not mine, but the national data, you hear that it seems to correlate with suicide and violence. Is that sense that, but looking for someone to really see me as I see myself, I can't find a guy that I can do that with, and then feeling sort of desperate for that connection and not finding it. Now, obviously, Avivah, I always have to say there's tremendous variation in any group of people you interview, so it's not like everybody said that, but the majority definitely said that. I've been hearing it for decades, and I've also been hearing it from my readers for decades, that quote unquote, I'm telling their story. Yeah. That's the third theme, the crisis of connection that boys taught us that happens from early to late adolescence. Then the final theme is, why are they having a crisis of connection? And that's the big story of Rebels. That is really the point of Rebels, is rebels with a cause. So what do they teach us about why they start to disconnect from what they want and need, which is human relationships and friendships? And the answer really is what I call in my new book, boy culture, and boy in quotations, meaning it's not a real boy, it's a cartoon character that's taught to us by boys, which is a boy with only a hard side and doesn't have a soft side. And by hard side, I mean only wants to be stoic and autonomous and independent and
a stereotype of a boy.
Yeah, it's a stereotype. It's a gender stereotype. So boy culture is, we live in a boy culture that doesn't just affect, and that's the big take home here, a boy culture that doesn't just affect boys and men and makes them crazy and wanted to kill themselves and wants to kill themselves and kill each other, but it's actually making us all crazy because the whole culture is boy culture. And by boy culture, I want to just 1 second really explain to your audience what I'm saying, how I'm defining that. I'm not just talking about being tough and stoic, sort of stereotypically boyish. I'm really talking about the deep immaturity of our culture, boy, not man, right? In the sense of it's money over people. That's a deeply toys over people, money and toys over people, as I always say. That's deeply immature. That's not just like problematic, it's immature. Revenge over reconciliation. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Thinking over feeling, all those kinds of privileging, thinking over feeling. I mean, think about that. We live in a culture that privileges thinking over feeling. I mean, any culture that's going to privilege thinking over feeling is going to be deeply screwed up. And so the idea is with all these sort of hard values over the soft values, numbers over words, I mean, I could go on and on and on, that basically it creates, this is the mechanism, okay? I'll explain it very quickly. The mechanism by which the culture creates the craziness is that we live in a culture that ultimately clashes with our nature. So our nature is we're social animals. We need each other. We have the relational skills to have quality relationships. We live in a culture that doesn't value any of that. They don't value our relationships. It's not even in definition of maturity. We don't even have having mutually supportive relationships as a definition of maturity.
Yeah.
I mean, stunning. So the idea is embedded in this boy culture is a hierarchy, what I always call a hierarchy of humans. Some humans are considered more human than others. Patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, those are all a hierarchy of humans. Some humans are seen as more humans than others, but also human qualities, the hard qualities, are privileged over the soft qualities.
Yep.
So living in such a boy culture creates, and this is the big term I'm going to throw out there for your audience. It's not mine. It's Jonathan Shea's, who's a psychiatrist who worked with Vietnam vets. It causes moral injury. Jonathan Shea defines it as such. When people in authority tell you to do something or believe in something that you know are not true, that you know is not good.
Yep.
And we have an entire culture saying to you, money over people, toys over people, thinking over feeling, academic achievement over friendships, academic achievement over anything else, getting into Harvard over everything else. And young people know that that's immoral. And they know that it's wrong, and they feel like they have to follow it anyway. And Jonathan Shea says, according to veterans, this is from veterans, but I'm applying it to developmental theory, is it causes moral injury. And moral injury means that it causes a disconnect from yourself, from your needs of the self, and a disconnect to others. And that disconnect from self, of course, then if you can't see your own humanity, then you can't see the humanity of other people. And then shebang. That happens. We live in a culture, clashes with our nature, and then we elect someone like Trump, whose whole party is built on hate and violence. So the idea is the way we got here, how we got here in the current situation with our new administration that has a whole party premised on...
It is boy culture personified.
Literally is boy culture.
Why do young boys vote for him? What was this big gender?
Because I'll tell you. Because they feel, and this is the really hard thing for people to hear, because it's not a critique of the right or the left. Yeah. It's just a fact of what boys teach us. They feel remember, there's a hierarchy of humanness in boy culture. They feel put on the bottom of the hierarchy. And so ultimately, I don't want to have an argument with any of my friends because they always push back and say, yeah, but they're not on the bottom. And I'm like, no, it's not a matter of objectively what's happening. Because a lot of people say, for example, women aren't really on the bottom. They're actually on the top. But the fact of the matter is women feel that they've been put on the bottom. So men feel they've been put on the bottom, right? And the reality is that no one wants to be on the bottom. So if you put men, especially men who have previously perceived to be on the top, on the bottom, and they have weapons, and I say this to my students and they always laugh, and I say, I'm not kidding. If they have weapons, they might try to kill you. Because the idea is you are putting someone on the bottom of a hierarchy of humanness, which means that you're saying your needs are less important. And if your needs are actually to put food on the table, to get pushed through an opiate addiction phase in your family, or have housing, or have health care, and you've been put on the bottom of a hierarchy, you feel like the country has put you on the bottom of the hierarchy, you're going to vote for the only person who says, hey, I'm not going to put you on the bottom. Now, regardless of whether he's actually going to put you on the bottom, because Trump's not going to do anything for them. But the point is that he says exactly, he got it. Regardless of what I feel about Trump, he did get it.
And he talked to them directly through...
He talked to them directly.
People they trusted.
He didn't talk down to them. He didn't say you're stupid. He didn't say, you're full of hate, even though Trump is also full of hate. He said, basically, I see you, I care about you, and I'm not going to put you on the bottom, and I'm going to make sure your needs are met. And so to me, it's so obvious. And so the solution is, and this is the warning to the right, and we'll get back to the book in 1 second, but the warning to the left, sorry, not to the right, to the left, is we can't respond by then flipping the hierarchy again. Like we can't respond by saying, oh no, because you're sexist and racist, you should be on the bottom. Because are you kidding me? That might feel good, as I always say, that might feel good at the moment, but it's not good for long-term liberation. You know what I mean?
I violently agree with you, Niobe.
Yeah. So we got to stop doing it. And we have to figure out how to make all human fundamental needs, food, housing, healthcare, jobs, all humans' needs for those four things are equal across party, across identities. How do we create a country? How do we create a country that sees all humans as equally human, that doesn't just try to flip the hierarchy in terms of identity, and that understands that basic needs are much more important than secondary needs? And I'm even going to speak as a woman for a second, because this is a hard one. This is a hard one to say as a woman who has a lot of gender violence in my family. I have experienced a lot of gender violence in my family. Even the Me Too movement is, unfortunately, what you have to say in the primary needs is a secondary need, in the sense that if you can't get food on the table, housing, jobs, and healthcare, and meaning it's a life or death situation, you have to focus on making sure people have that. And then you can focus on gender-based violence, all sorts of violence that are happening. But not getting the basic needs almost always causes the violence. So if you're thinking of prevention, you have to see gender-based violence, which is the biggest issue that's close to my heart, as secondary to food, housing, jobs, and healthcare. Because those stresses, those anxieties cause violence. I mean, they cause violence because they're desperately trying to figure things out, and they feel suicidal and all those kinds of horrible things. So the point is
the health of men.
Yeah, exactly. The health of men matters. And we're seeing the impact of not caring about the health of men, because why should we care about men? They've always had the power, especially white men. Why should we care about men? They've always had the power. Well, we should care because we are not men. That's why we should care, because they're making
women will only be okay if men are okay. Otherwise,
of course.
It's
no, of course,
us versus them.
And including, and I hate to say this, but you have to say it, including white privileged men, including Mark Zuckerberg. We have to, the reason I honestly think he's so off his rockers with his whole virtual stuff that's, totally crazy to me, is he's deeply disconnected from his own humanity. He's deeply disconnected, and he's in a money over people to such an extreme degree. But we create the monster, Avivah. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. We create the monster, and then we wonder what happened. Yeah. But we created it. So I'll stop there.
Okay. So that's a pretty clear, I think, picture of America today and the reaction to this recent election and why young men got so entranced with his message. How do you see it across countries? Is this a global phenomenon, and how much have you worked across different countries?
Yeah, so I do lots of work around the world. So I've been doing a 20-year study in China since 2005, following 1,200 families, looking at the impact of political and social contexts on families and children. We've done some gender-based studies looking at the construction of gender, girl, boy, and friendships in our data. So I know some stuff, we've published off of some of this, but I'll just tell you generally. And also, I was born in Paris, France, and my ex-husband was from Berlin, and my kids I'm sort of European. I've lived in Europe, I've lived in the Middle East, and I've lived in China for a long time. And we also did a study in India for a while. So what you see around the world, and I see this in my daily life, and even living in China versus in the 1980s versus 2007, I saw a huge difference in the introduction of American culture. And I'll give you an example. So in 1985 to 1986, when I lived in Nanjing with my father, he was a professor in Nanjing, men always held hands. Friends who were men on the street were always holding hands. They were holding hands. They were hugging each other. You see this in a lot of rural areas around the world, that men are very physically intimate with each other. Women are too, but you're more struck by it with men. Yeah. I remember thinking in 1986, oh, they look gay. Right? Like I wondered, and then I thought, well, no, but they're all doing it. So they can't all be gay. And homosexuality was outlawed at the time. So there's no way that they were gay, or at least, openly gay. And so the idea is I had coded it in my American way, right? That must be gay. Yep. Then I moved back to Shanghai in 2007 with my children, and I was teaching there for a while. And I never saw that. I never saw any physical intimacy between men. And when I asked people about it, it had now been coded as gay. Right. And you're getting that around the world. In the Middle East, you see men from Abu Dhabi when I used to go there 10 years ago, they would touch each other's noses, nose to nose, as a form of greeting. Now I never see it. And when I've asked why it's disappeared, they said, well, it looks kind of gay. And so the idea is the American homophobic craziness that has turned emotional and physical intimacy into sexuality, which is America's gift.
Agape, yes, exactly.
Gift to the world has mean that American masculinity is everywhere at this point. And proof of what I'm saying is not just my anecdotal stories, but the movie Close that came out, that's a Belgian film that's based on my Deep Secrets book, my book that came out 12 years ago, is about two Belgian boys. And I talked to the screenwriter and the director. who said he read Deep Secrets and he realized it was his story in high school. So he wanted to tell the story, but he made this Oscar-nominated film called Close. Everybody should see it. It's on Amazon Prime. Although, too bad it's on Amazon Prime. But you can get it on Amazon.
It's still worth watching. We'll still plug it.
It's still worth watching. Yeah, exactly. But the point is that movie, he won 110 awards around the world, or nominated or won. It won the Grand Prix award at Cannes. I mean, it was huge. And so it was saying that the theme in Deep Secrets touched a nerve around the world. Around the world. It's a global story. And the reason is because American masculinity is now around the world.
Yep.
Physical. I mean, I want to repeat that so your listeners hear that, because it's so crazy.
How much do you think this meltdown and exportation of this very particular form of masculinity and crisis of connection, how much do you ascribe that for the fall in fertility rates all over the world? What's the link for you?
Oh, completely. I mean, are you kidding me? First of all, it's the me over we. Yeah. I mean, one of the big things in boy culture, it's the me, me, me. And what you hear from young people, and I'm not going to name countries because I don't want to out countries, but we've done these studies in various countries. People don't want to have children not just because it's expensive, because they want to focus on themselves. And that's okay. For women, it's called liberation. But there is a way in which there is a kind of, I'm not going to frame it in a sort of me versus we actually for a second, but there is a kind of sense of like, children get in the way of me finding what I want to find, rather than thinking about children can be, if you have the economics to have, I mean, all those things. I don't want to be weirdly, like, I don't want to sound like our new vice president, like about children. I'm just saying the idea that children could be a form of building community, right? Building community. We definitely have a population crisis. So my children don't want to have children because they say we have too many children anyway. But I'm just saying the whole sense of the reasons why people are giving for not wanting children are typically not what my children are saying. They're saying things like, I want to focus on me and I want to be able to have the income to do what I want to do and travel the world, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to really critique that, but I'm just saying boy culture encourages that kind of thing. And if it was just that alone, that might be a good thing, especially for women. But I do think when it goes with everything's a me, 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 it's everything about how does it affect me? How does it affect me? And there's no sense of, even in the young feminists, I've had this discussion with my 22-year-old daughter, that feminism is now being perceived as it's all about me.
Yeah.
And I'll say, this is very difficult, Avivah, and I think it's very, very important that women our age communicate clearly to young feminists that the feminist movement is not just now, it's all about me. It's not flipping the hierarchy. Yeah. It's not all about me, me, me. And I have fights with my daughter around this. Yeah. And she'll say, well, that's not what I want to do. And I'll say, well, listen, feminism is actually disrupting the hierarchy. And it's saying that there's no, and this is Carol Gilligan, there's no relationship. If the self is not in a relationship, there's no relationship. But if the other is not in a relationship, there's no relationship. So the self and the other, right? The self and the other have to be in a relationship. Care for self and care for other is Carol Gilligan's radical notion of care.
And we know from all the happiness studies that human happiness is rooted in relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And it has to be both. Happiness has to be about care for self and care for other. And if someone gets sacrificed in the relationship, there's no relationship. If the self does or the other gets sacrificed, there's no relationship. And that, to me, that's feminism.
Yeah.
Because that's saying nobody gets to be on top of a hierarchy. Nobody gets to be on top of a hierarchy. Feminism is not flipping the hierarchy. And I think, and I'm speaking to you as a feminist, I think we really have to, in the feminist movement, make that very clear. We're not interested in flipping the hierarchy. That won't stop the violence.
Yeah,
it'll just perpetuate it.
No. We can't switch places. It's not going to work that way.
Yeah.
Sadly. Let's conclude with the way forward. We've kind of done a pretty damning overview of what the culture has created, what capitalism has created, this crisis of connection that's being exported all over the world. So you've talked about the link between curiosity and connection. I love that word. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah. So what I've discovered, in some ways it comes from listening, my team and I listening to boys and young men for so many years, and then hearing Carol Gilligan and her team listen to girls and young women, is that it really came from listening with curiosity that we heard new stories rather than trying to affirm. I'll get to more practical response in a second, but rather than assuming we know about this population and then confirming a hypothesis.
Yep.
Both her team and my team went at it to what can we learn from, by listening with curiosity, learn from these populations about them, and learn stories we hadn't heard. And I call it in my new book, thick stories. Hear the thick story rather than the thin story. So in some ways, curiosity became obvious in even the approach we take to our research, which is what can we learn rather than is our hypothesis right or wrong, which is called an close-ended question, which doesn't help you learn new stories. So now jump ahead. We started a method called transformative interviewing in schools about 10 years ago. We teach kids, we've been doing this for it's about 7 years where we've gotten funding, but we've been doing it for about 9 years. And where we're teaching a practice of listening with curiosity. It has 9 practices. It's written about in the new book that teaches us how to engage with each other, reimagines how we engage with each other. So rather than looking at your partner or your friend or your student or whomever it is, saying, what is wrong with you? Or what can I teach you? To say,
give you some bias training.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. To say, what can you teach me? Not only about you, but about me, your answers to my questions. So the idea is to reimagine what we even mean by everybody. I always say this, everybody has something to teach and everybody has something to learn. I don't care what age you are. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what culture you come from. You have something to teach and you have something to learn. Even 2-year-olds, they have something to teach and they have something to learn. So the idea is if you approach talking, then you pull the 5-year-old natural curiosity, the sense of wonder we have when we look at each other and we say, what can you teach me? And I want to know why, and all the why questions that young children have, that is at the essence of our humanity, because this is it. And this is the big take home for everybody listening. When you ask why, when you ask questions, genuine questions, and then follow-up questions, why, how, when did that happen? What does that mean to you? Give me an example of that. Tell me a story about that. When you ask those kinds of follow-up questions, you all of a sudden see the other person outside of a set of stereotypes. Because once you start asking questions, you cannot stereotype someone anymore. Because inevitably, once they start giving you the thick story, the stereotype falls apart. Because a stereotype is a flat image of somebody. So the idea is once you start engaging with curiosity, stereotypes fall apart. But this is the interesting thing. Not only do you transform how you see the other, you transform how you see yourself. Because all of a sudden you recognize things in ways you are similar to that person who may look different from you, but also the way you're different. So you begin to see if someone's similar to you, the ways you're different, and if someone's different than you, the way you're similar. So you begin to see yourself. So we call it differently. So we call it transformative interview because it transforms how you see the other, but it also transforms how you see yourself. Yep. And so that once you see yourself, Toni Morrison said this. She said she created characters from her novels to get you to see yourself in her characters. And I would say our method gets you to see yourself in the other. And once you see yourself and it goes both ways, there's a relationship. There's a genuine relationship. But you have to get there. And you have to break down boy culture that teaches us stupid stuff. Like if I share my vulnerabilities and you share your vulnerabilities, Avivah, we'll be close. Like, it's just boy culture bullshit, because ultimately sharing something that doesn't create intimacy. What creates intimacy is when I say, oh, Viva, tell me more about that. And then what happened? And why did you feel that? Oh, I get it. Okay. And then, but I'm curious about this. Like when someone gets those kinds of questions about something that they care about, they feel seen and heard. And we know that in the data. They feel seen and heard, and they oftentimes get very emotional, because they've never had someone really ask them questions about something they care about. And I do this with undergraduates too in my classrooms, and I get them to do it with each other, and they will turn to me and say the most amazing things, almost always with tears in their eyes, men included. And they'll say, I never knew it was so easy to connect to somebody else. And that's the message I have here. A little
terrifying. Yep.
Right. No, exactly. And the thing is that why I see it as the tool of resistance, curiosity as the tool of resistance, is because we are born naturally curious. And we don't nourish it. We don't even study it in child development. Interpersonal curiosity is not even a topic in child development. So we don't nourish it. We don't value it. And I'm even defining it nowadays. I'm defining it as the definition of relational intelligence is listening with curiosity. That is the definition of relational intelligence. Once you foster your natural relational intelligence, your capacity to listen with curiosity to another person, you solve your crisis of connection. You solve it. And so ultimately, I want to create a curiosity revolution. I'm calling out all your listeners. I want everyone to be a part of it. We're trying to do it through technology. We're building an app now called Agape Teens. Agape means love of humans in Greek. And it's going to be the first friendship app built for and with teenagers. We have 16 teenagers working on it right now. We'll have a minimally viable product, an MVP, ready in May to test it out nationwide. And it's using our 9 practices. It's gamifying our 9 practices. But there's a lot of other possibilities. There's a lot of other products you could build. We want to get a Be Curious campaign, like the Be Real campaign, where a question comes up on your phone and you have to ask somebody in your immediate vicinity within 3 minutes the question and then report what the answer is. And there's so many playful things we could do, but I want to create a curiosity revolution and embed it in technology, because the problem is not technology. I just got to do that before we end. The problem is not technology. It is the way we use technology that is the problem, is that we create a technology that's all about with a like function. A like function is boy culture. Do you like me? Do you not like me? And then friendship becomes how much do you like me rather than how likable I am. The way we're using technology is a reflection of being created by boys, right, who exacerbate boy culture. So the idea is you just got to change how we use technology, and you got to figure out how to embed curiosity into technology. Does there also need to be structural change and disrupting a capitalist way of thinking? Absolutely. But I'm just saying, this is not a structural or a psychological. I'm saying the part I can contribute to, and my community can, and you can as a listener, and Avivah, you, is by starting right now, today. Don't stop. Don't hesitate. Start asking questions of each other, real questions, engaging in curiosity, nourish it in your children, nourish it in your partner, nourish it in your communities. And once we really start asking questions of each other, genuine questions, I don't mean hostile questions. Why are you so aggressive? I'm talking about actually
not today's dinner conversation question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, genuine questions, like these are the questions teenagers want us to ask them. Okay, are you ready? Young adults. Where do you feel like you belong? Where do you feel like you're listened to? Where do you feel safe? What makes you happy? What makes you joyful? Tell me about a time in which you felt happy. I have hundreds and hundreds of questions of what young people say that, what do you value? They're starving to be asked that. What do you value and why do you value that? And when we ask them, why do you want to be asked those questions? This is what they always say. I tell you, it's unbelievable. They say, to be seen how I see myself rather than how I'm stereotyped to be. Done. So start asking questions, right? Yeah. Start asking questions. And then we will be more open to massive structural change, to Bernie Sanders, healthcare for all. We will become more open to that perspective because we will begin to see ourselves in the other. And that's really the problem. We're not even seeing ourselves, number one, but we're certainly not seeing each other.
We're retreating into camps very quickly.
Into camps, exactly.
So I love that like is a boy culture artifact. And what we need to create, sweep that away, use technology, harness it, but in order to actually listen with curiosity. Niobe Way, I can't thank you enough for that spirited defense of a more human relational intelligence. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thanks, Avivah. That was fantastic.
Fantastic. Thank you. See you. We'll check in next spring with the app, see how it's doing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.